Hello, this is Thaddeus Kaczynski here, professor for your class, Reason and the Theology of St. Thomas. This will be the first of a series of video presentations on the texts, and hopefully this will be helpful for you to have as you read and do the discussion questions and other assignments. Well, let's get right down to the text here. The Aquinas lecture of 1990 was given by Alistair MacIntyre, notable living Thomist of today, most notably for his moral, ethical, political philosophy and his trilogy of books, After Virtue, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry. Of course, he has many other books which are well worth reading. MacIntyre in this lecture is giving us an amazingly dense, comprehensive, broad narrative of Thomistic inquiry, analysis, narrative, as well as an argument in defense of it against both what he calls analytic anti-foundationalism and deconstructionism, a la Derrida and Rorty. I thought this would be a good text to read for this course, which is also a very broad and ambitious course to try to treat such a amazingly rich and dense and comprehensive topic as reason in the theology of St. Thomas. MacIntyre attempts a very ambitious task in this article, mainly to give us a sense of what inquiry is in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, the role of and nature of first principles, telos or end, and how this understanding of inquiry and justification and truth has been attacked by, firstly, the Enlightenment, foundationalism, what he calls post-Cartesian philosophy, and the reaction against that in the postmodern analytic, positivist, anti-foundationalists, as well as modern science, as well as postmodern deconstructionism. So it's a tall order MacIntyre has in this article, and it's a long one and extensive. There are 5 parts to it, each of which one could lecture for an hour on to get to the heart of it and the details. I don't intend to spend that much time on even all 5 parts, but just to give a sense of MacIntyre's overall project in this lecture and how he goes about it, some of the main themes, and looking at some of the important quotations from it. So let's start from the beginning. My text is from this book, The Task of Philosophy. The one I gave you was online, so the pages don't match up, but I believe you have 5 parts, so you can follow along if you'd like, and see if you can find where I am in the text. So starting right from the beginning here, MacIntyre begins saying, "Nothing is more generally unacceptable in recent philosophy than any conception of a first principle." What MacIntyre tends to do very well is to show how different philosophical systems, paradigms, are incommensurable with each other and cannot be adjudicated from a kind of neutral standpoint. Their principles tend to be so divergent from each other that one cannot simply argue for or against with an interlocutor between these systems, because their very understanding of what it means to have rational justification and truth to win, as it were, an argument, are so radically discrepant with each other that effective communication cannot really occur. MacIntyre promotes what he calls tradition-constituted inquiry, which, on the one hand, claims that our very thoughts, concepts, modes of argumentation, modes of justification for arguments have their origin and their even intelligibility within a tradition of understanding that has a history, that's located, as it were. And so you might think because of that he would be an historicist or a relativist and say that truth is um, reducible to social agreement or historical cultural context, that kind of thing. But he doesn't say that. He wants to say that from within a robustly traditional and located historical context of an argument, and he says that tradition is a historically extended argument. From within that, and only with the resources that such a tradition provides, can we attain to truth that is tradition transcendent and known to be such. So MacIntyre combines both the kind of insights of postmodernism, those insights having to do with the sort of locatedness of our thoughts and arguments in history and in culture and in language. At the same time, MacIntyre, being a Thomist, allows for the capacity of the human mind to know reality as it is, adequatio intellectum in re, intellect knowing the thing as it is in itself, even if it's always mediated by tradition, language, history, culture. So that's MacIntyre's overall project. You might say between relativism, between postmodern relativism and modern foundationalism, a la Descartes, Kant, Hegel. Okay, so MacIntyre basically begins the essay by talking about principium and arche, as well as aitia and causa and telos. These words he defines for us and understands. And he wants to say that the Thomistic, Aristotelian Thomistic use of the notion of a principle is radically different from both the Enlightenment notion of a first principle, and because of that, the rejection of the Enlightenment notion of first principles doesn't really work against the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. They never, as it were, heard of, really understood on their own terms the Aristotelian Thomistic understanding of a first principle. So he begins with a suggestion of that. I'll just read a quote here, a few pages in. He says, so it is that causa and principium are to be adequately elucidated only within a scheme of thought in which the mind moves toward its own proper end, its telos, an achieved state, in which it is informed by an understanding of its own progress towards that end, an understanding completed by an apprehension of first principles. The meaning of these expressions is not independent of the context of theory within which they are employed. So, what MacIntyre argues here is that first principle has intelligibility and rational justification only within a context of inquiry of which the telos is truth and rational justification. And I guess the most important claim that MacIntyre makes is that these first principles are not the beginning of inquiry. We don't begin with them in the way we would begin with some kind of what he calls epistemologically first principle, such as the cogito of Descartes, I think, therefore I am. They are actually the end of inquiry. The achievement of the first principle is, in a sense, the perfection of inquiry. What comes after the achievement and grasp of first principles would be seeing all the deductive conclusions that flow from them in light of them. But that comes way at the end of inquiry. We do not begin with first principles. We begin in media res, as it were, with what he calls later on a kind of knowing and not knowing, right? And we'll get to that a little bit later. And this is, of course, in radical distinction from what he calls post-Cartesian philosophy. And because post-Cartesian philosophy got first principles wrong, thought that you had to begin with them, we end up at the end of, let's say, philosophy's road, with the death of metaphysics, we end up with the only kind of first principle you can have is something called something that has warranted assertability, meaning it relates to other principles in a coherent sort of system, but the beginning point is arbitrary, right? The coherence is there, but there's no sort of real justification for where you begin. Every assertion is dependent on other assertions in a kind of irrational circularity. The other alternative is the denial of the knowability of first principles, because, well, the other aspect of the arbitrariness is that they're decided upon within a social context by convention, by agreement, and that's seen as the only justification you can have. And then, of course, you could deny they could exist altogether, because there can't be a ground of language that's extra linguistic. But if it was within language, then it couldn't be the ground of linguistic assertions. So we'll get to that a little later. Okay. So in the next section 2, MacIntyre argues against the existence of what he calls epistemological first principles. These are principles that are both known to be true and known that they're known to be true, in the sense that you not only know something about the world, you also know that you know about the world simultaneously. Somehow the principles can sort of do both works at the same time, serve both purposes. A good example is, of course, I think, therefore I am, as an epistemological and ontological first-person perspective, first principle. And MacIntyre here, again, contrasts this with the Thomistic understanding of two different kinds of first principles, both coming from a third-person perspective, about the world, and then reflecting on the self. There are first principles that are known to be such self-evidently, you might call this analytic in the Kantian terminology. The whole is greater than the part. Once you understand what a whole is, then the part follows. But there's not much substance there to such an assertion. It's sort of like the law of non-contradiction. It's a very formal, structural, self-evident truth, but doesn't do much work in the empirical world, or even in the metaphysical world. Those first principles that do have substantive content are evident only to those who have a grasp of the theoretical structure in which they play a part. In other words, you can't just know them just by knowing the meaning of a word. You have to have done a lot of work within a certain way of thinking and a certain science. So, an angel is without a body, for instance, would be one of these first principles. You'd have to know quite a bit about metaphysics and theology to understand what that means. Aquinas says these are things that are self-evident to the wise. Okay. So MacIntyre in the next part here, again, contrasts the Thomistic understanding, Aristotelian understanding of inquiry and knowledge with the foundationalist Enlightenment view. And here's where there's a very important understanding of inquiry as, again, obtaining truth and justification and finality in some sense. There's no skepticism here in Thomistic metaphysics, for instance. There's knowledge. On the other hand, there's a sense in which there's a provisional, ineradicable provisionality about our truth claims, because we can always inquire more and learn more and revise and even correct our claims in light of further evidence. Okay, this is especially true, of course, in the empirical sciences, but even in philosophical disciplines, and that's because our knowledge is sort of both we know and we don't know. Okay, and that's especially true in the beginning of inquiry. We do not begin with certainty. We also don't begin with complete provisionality. Okay, so this is sort of the paradox, the Platonic paradox of knowledge, right? If you're trying to find something to be true, but if you don't have any idea what it is at all, you'll never find it. But if you do know what it is, you don't have to look. You've already found it. So how is knowledge possible? Well, it's possible because there's a sense in which we both know and we don't know. This comes from Aristotle in his Organon, posterior analytics particularly. So I'll have a quote here from MacIntyre. Um, If, on the view of Aristotle and Aquinas, one genuinely knows it all, then one knows as one would know if one knew in the light of the relevant set of first principles, but one may, nonetheless, genuinely know without as yet possessing the kind of further knowledge of first principles and of their relationship to this particular piece of knowledge, which would finally vindicate one's claim. Hence we can know without as yet knowing that we know, which is, of course, Pace Descartes. Again, he says there's a certain kind of circularity in this. Not the type of circularity, the presence of which vitiates a demonstrative argument. So you can have demonstrative knowledge even within this circularity. It is the circularity of which Aquinas speaks in endorsing Aristotle's view, quote, that before an induction or syllogism is formed to beget knowledge of a conclusion, that conclusion is somehow known and somehow not known, end quote. And that's from his commentary on the Posterior Analytics, Book 1, Lecture 3. And this is going to be a claim he makes throughout the article, that the conclusion which is to be the end of our deductively or inductively reasoned inquiry is somehow already assumed in our starting point. So this is a very kind of paradoxical, difficult concept to grasp. We're trying to achieve knowledge, demonstrative knowledge of judgments that apply to reality, that conform to reality. First principles are, primary desire. Well, what is the level of knowledge we have before we've achieved a first principle? Well, there's a sense in which the first principles are presumed in our knowledge of what follows for them, and we work backwards towards the first principle, having a kind of shadowy intuition about them and working towards, eventually uncovering them, right, and seeing them, grasping them through what he calls later in the article insight or nous. To get there, we begin with dialectic, as he'll say later on. And the dialectic doesn't achieve the first principles; it paves the way, and let's say disposes one by ferreting out all the insufficient and rationally non-justifiable principles, by kind of seeing why they don't work. The first principles just sort of show up to your mind. And then you achieve knowledge of them, and then you go back and look at all those provisional claims that you were making in light of them, and see why your intuition about their being true was indeed correct. So that's sort of my description of how this works, trying to paraphrase what MacIntyre is saying here. He alludes here to the deconstructionists who claim that there are no determinate meaning in any terms, form and matter, potentiality, actuality, for instance, because every term requires the other term for its meaning, right? This is Derrida difference. But he says here that, well, the Thomist has no problem with this in a sense. I'll read a quote. For the Thomist, the Thomist has no problem either with the notion that, where such a pair as form and matter or potentiality and act are concerned, each term is and must be partially definable by reference to the other, or with the view that when such terms are applied at some earlier intermediate stage in an inquiry, the full meaning of what has been said is yet to emerge, and will only emerge when the relevant set of first principles is as fully specified as that particular inquiry requires. Terms are applied analogically. in respect both of meaning and of use, and the grounding of meaning and use through analogies by reference to some ultimate arche and principium, so that stability of meaning is, on a Thomistic view, tied to a metaphysically conceived ground, just as Derrida asserts. And the denial of that ground, it follows equally for the Thomist and the deconstructionist, could not but issue in systematic instability of meaning. So the instability of meaning is okay for the Thomist, not the foundationalist Enlightenment thinker, because at some point that stability will be stabilized. Instability will be stabilized by the achievement of knowledge of first principles, the telos of inquiry. And so provisional instability is fine, and you can even claim a certain level of knowledge in that provisional instability. As we see later on, MacIntyre kind of agrees with the paradox of Aristotelian treatises. On the one hand, he says in the Posterior Analytics, here's what a completed science looks like, perfect science, and none of the sciences he actually gives us, the physics, the ethics, the metaphysics, is a completed science. It bears hardly any resemblance to the structure of knowledge in the Posterior Analytics. And that's because, as MacIntyre claims, based on a lot of scholars who agree, that what's going on in the Posterior Analytics is what it would like to have a perfected science and to teach it, whereas in the other treatises, these are inquiries, of course. These are not perfected sciences. They're in good shape, but they're sort of on their way. They're partially completed inquiries, you might say. And that makes sense, because that's what science tends to be, right? It's progressive. On the other hand, you read these foundationalist Enlightenment treatises, Thomas Hobbes and Descartes, even Kant. This is the culmination of all knowledge. There's no more to say about metaphysics. For instance, in Kant, here's what metaphysics is. It's a critical metaphysics now. We only know the limits of our knowledge, and metaphysics is sort of an empty science of the mind seeking completion. It never was what metaphysicians said it was. It's what I say it was, and that's a sort of notorious pattern in the Enlightenment thinkers, not to see their inquiry as partial and to be extended by further ones. Of course, the postmodernists say no inquiry can ever come to any truth, and it's always provisional. That's because there's no possibility of progress. And we'll see later on, MacIntyre shows that this is self-contradictory. Okay, section 3 is where MacIntyre discusses what I just said about the Posterior Analytics and its sort of status and its relation to the other sciences of Aristotle. And again, I'll just quote one of these oft-repeated things that makes sense of his whole theory here. He says, what matters about his discussion of understanding still in the process of formation, still in progress in the Posterior Analytics, is the light cast thereby on the way in which the telos of perfected understanding is already presupposed in partial understanding. The telos of perfected understanding is presupposed in partial understanding. Okay. We get a good definition here of science. A perfected science in the Aristotelian tradition is one which enables us to understand the phenomena of which it treats as necessarily being what they are, will be, and have been, because of the variety of agencies which have brought it about. That form of specific kinds has informed the relevant matter in such a way as to achieve some specific end state. Again, it's about knowledge of causes. The mind which has achieved this perfected understanding in some particular area represents what it understands. The form of understanding and the form of what is understood necessarily coincide in perfected understanding. That is what it is to understand by a deductive scheme in whose hierarchical structure the different levels of causal explanation are embodied. To give an explanation is to provide a demonstrative argument which captures part of this structure. What causal explanation enables us to distinguish is genuine causality from mere coincidence. And he mentions that this kind of understanding of first principles, which specify the ultimate causal agencies, material, formal, efficient, and final, there's a hierarchy of such sciences ultimately grounded in the ultimate science of God, which is to say, first philosophy, natural theology, or metaphysics, the study of God as known from his effects. Okay. Well, I think I'll finish the lecture there. About halfway through this magnificent and very dense lecture, and we'll continue in our next lecture. So stay tuned. Hopefully, this is helpful to you, and look forward to your questions and comments in the discussion board. Take care.